Number 1. Rex Heuermann. Rex Heuermann was a 60-year-old architect who'd spent more than 3 decades working in Manhattan. On January 26, 2023, he walked out of his office on 5th Avenue, grabbed a slice of pizza for lunch, and threw the box into a trash can on the street. What he didn't know was that investigators had been watching him for months. The moment he walked away, they moved in, pulled the box from the trash, and sent it to a lab. Inside was a half-eaten crust. That pizza crust would connect Heuermann to a series of murders that had haunted Long Island for more than a decade. Between 2007 and 2010, at least 4 young women disappeared from the New York area. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, vanished in July 2007 after traveling from Connecticut to Manhattan to meet a client. Melissa Barthelemy, 24, was last seen in the Bronx in July 2009. Megan Waterman, 22, left a hotel in Hauppauge in June 2010 and never came back. Amber Costello, 27, walked out of her home in North Babylon in September 2010 to meet someone who'd offered her $1,500. All 4 women worked as escorts and advertised their services on Craigslist. All 4 were petite, standing under 5'2", and all 4 disappeared without a trace. On December 11, 2010, a police officer and his cadaver dog were searching for a different missing woman along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. Instead, they found a skeleton wrapped in burlap about 500 feet from the road. It was Melissa Barthelemy. 2 days later, investigators found 3 more bodies within a quarter mile. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. All 4 had been strangled. All were wrapped in burlap. They became known as the Gilgo 4. Over the next few months, police discovered more remains in the area. Some belonged to women who'd been killed years earlier. Jessica Taylor, whose dismembered body had been found in Manorville in 2003, turned up again near Gilgo Beach. Valerie Mack, who disappeared in 2000, was found in pieces, scattered between Manorville and the beach. In total, at least 11 sets of human remains were recovered along that stretch of highway. Detectives believed they were looking at a serial killer who targeted sex workers, but the case went cold. There were no hits in the DNA database and no clear leads. The investigation stalled for over a decade. Then in February 2022, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office put together a new task force. On March 14th, an investigator ran a vehicle search and found something. A witness had reported seeing a dark green Chevrolet Avalanche outside Amber Costello's home the day before she disappeared. The witness described the driver as a white male, 6'4" to 6'6", with dark bushy hair and oversized 1970s-style glasses. Only one person in the area fit that description and owned that exact type of truck: Rex Heuermann. Heuermann had lived in Massapequa Park his entire life, just a few miles from where the victims were last seen. He was 6'6". He had dark hair and wore large, outdated eyeglasses. He'd been married since 1996 and had 2 children. Neighbors described him as quiet, someone who kept to himself. He ran an architecture firm in Manhattan and had worked there since 1987. On the surface, he seemed unremarkable, but when investigators dug deeper, they found something else. Heuermann had been using burner phones to contact sex workers. Cell phone records showed those phones had been in Midtown Manhattan and on Long Island when the victims disappeared. One of the phones used to contact Amber Costello had traveled from Manhattan to Massapequa Park, then to her neighborhood in West Babylon. After Melissa Barthelemy vanished, someone used her phone to make harassing calls to her 15-year-old sister. Investigators believe that was Heuermann. They also found his search history. Between March 2022 and June 2023, Heuermann had conducted more than 200 online searches related to the case. He looked up information about the victims, their families, the police investigation, and active serial killers. He searched for phrases like, "Why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught?" He viewed images of the crime scenes and read articles about the task force that was investigating him. On his computer, police later found what they described as a planning document. It was a checklist. It included instructions for before, during, and after the murders. Steps like burn gloves, dispose of pics, and have story set, meaning an alibi. They also found a large collection of violent pornography dating back to 1994. Prosecutors said the images matched the way some of the victims' bodies had been found. But investigators needed more than circumstantial evidence. In 2010, a male hair had been recovered from the burlap used to wrap Megan Waterman's body. At the time, the technology wasn't good enough to get a DNA profile from it. By 2022, new methods allowed labs to extract DNA from degraded hair samples. The problem was, they needed a direct sample from Hoyerman to compare it to, so they started surveillance. They watched him for 16 months. They recovered bottles from outside his home that contained his wife's DNA. Female hairs found on several of the victims matched her genetic profile, but she'd been out of state during each of the murders. Her DNA had likely been transferred to the victims through Hoyerman's clothing or hands. What they needed was his DNA. On January 26, 2023, the surveillance team followed Hoyerman to his office on Fifth Avenue. They watched him eat pizza, wipe his mouth, and throw the box away. They pulled it from the trash and sent it to the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. On April 28th, a detective delivered the male hair from Megan Waterman's burlap to the same lab. On June 12th, analysts compared the two samples. The mitochondrial DNA profiles matched. The results showed that 99.96% of the North American population could be excluded as a match. Rex Heuermann could not be excluded. The hair on the burlap that had restrained and transported Megan Waterman's body was his. On July 13, 2023, police arrested Hoyerman outside his Manhattan office. He was carrying a burner phone. When officers took him into custody, he said, "What is this about?" The next day, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. Prosecutors also named him as the prime suspect in Maureen Brainerd Barnes' murder. He pleaded not guilty. The judge ordered him held without bail. Police searched his home in Massapequa Park for 12 days. They found between 200 and 300 guns locked in a hidden vault. They seized more than 350 electronic devices. In January 2024, Hoyerman was formally charged with Maureen Brainerd Barnes' murder. In June 2024, prosecutors added 2 more charges. Jessica Taylor, killed in 2003, and Sandra Costilla, whose body had been found in 1993. That pushed the timeline of his alleged crimes back 30 years. In December 2024, he was charged with the murder of Valerie Mack. He now faces 7 counts of murder. He's pleaded not guilty to all of them. In September 2025, a judge ruled that cutting-edge DNA technology could be used as evidence at trial. It was the first time that type of testing had been allowed in a New York courtroom. In January 2026, the judge set a trial date for September of this year. Heuermann remains in jail. His wife filed for divorce, days after his arrest. She said she had no knowledge of the crimes. If convicted, Hoyermann faces multiple life sentences. Number 2. Lonnie Franklin Jr. Lonnie Franklin Jr. lived on West 81st Street in South Central Los Angeles. Neighbors knew him as the friendly guy who spent his weekends working on cars in his driveway, chatting with people who walked by. He was married to a woman named Sylvia, had 2 kids, and worked as a garbage collector for the city. Nobody suspected that such a man was hunting women at night and had been doing it for decades. Franklin's first known victim was 29-year-old Deborah Jackson. On August 10, 1985, her body was found in a trash-filled alley in South Central. She'd been shot 3 times in the chest with a .25 caliber handgun. Over the next 3 years, 6 more women turned up dead in similar alleys, all shot with the same gun. In August '86, it was 35-year-old Henrietta Wright, found under a discarded mattress. In '87, 23-year-old Barbara Ware, 26-year-old Bernita Sparks, and 26-year-old Mary Lowe. In 1988, it was 22-year-old LaCrika Jefferson and 18-year-old Monique Alexander. All of them were black. Most struggled with addiction or worked the streets during the height of the crack epidemic. Their bodies were dumped like garbage, covered with debris or old mattresses, left in the same kinds of alleys Franklin drove through every day on his sanitation routes. On November 19, 1988, Franklin pulled up next to Initra Washington, a 30-year-old mother of 2 who was walking to a friend's house. He offered her a ride in his orange Ford Pinto. She said no. He responded, "That's what's wrong with you black women. People can't be nice to you." She felt bad and got in. A few minutes later, he shot her in the chest without warning. She asked him why. He said she disrespected him. He climbed on top of her, assaulted her, and took a Polaroid photo while she was bleeding and barely conscious. Then, He pushed her out of the moving car, assuming she was dead. She wasn't. She survived and gave police a description of her attacker and his car, but the case went nowhere. And then, suddenly, the murders stopped. For the next 14 years, no similar killings occurred in South Central. Detectives figured the killer had either died, gone to prison for something else, or just quit. The cases went cold. Franklin kept working, kept fixing cars in his driveway, kept living his double life. But in March 2002, a body turned up that matched the old pattern. 15-year-old Princess Berthomew was found in an alley, strangled and beaten. In July 2003, 35-year-old Valerie McCorvey was discovered, also strangled. The method had changed from shooting to strangulation, but the dumping grounds were the same. Then, on January 1st, 2007, the body of 25-year-old Janisha Peters was found shot to death, stuffed naked inside a plastic trash bag in a dumpster. DNA was recovered from a zip tie on the bag. That DNA matched samples from 7 unsolved murders back in the 80s. It also matched DNA from the 2 strangulation victims in 2002 and 2003. The killer hadn't stopped. He'd been operating for more than 20 years. Police formed a task force and gave the unknown killer a name. A journalist at LA Weekly called him the Grim Sleeper, referring to the apparent 14-year gap between murders. But there was a problem. The DNA didn't match anyone in the system. The killer had never been arrested for anything that required DNA submission. Detectives were stuck. In November 2008, California became the first state to allow something called familial DNA searching. It's a technique that looks for partial matches in criminal databases to identify close relatives of a suspect. Investigators ran the Grim Sleeper's DNA through the system that month. They found nothing. But they tried again in April 2010, and this time, they got a hit. A young man named Christopher Franklin, convicted of a felony weapons charge in 2009, had DNA markers showing he was likely a close relative of the killer. Detectives looked into Christopher's family. His father was Lonnie Franklin Jr., a 57-year-old garbage collector who'd lived in South Central during the entire span of the murders. He knew every alley, every dumpster, every backstreet in the area. He'd also worked part-time as a mechanic for the LAPD, but they couldn't arrest him yet. They needed his DNA to confirm the match, and they couldn't get a warrant without more evidence, so had to watch him closely. Sometime in May or June 2010, Franklin went to a birthday party at a restaurant in Los Angeles. An undercover detective was already there, dressed as a busboy. He waited until Franklin finished eating, then collected the pizza crust, the plate, the cup, and the silverware Franklin left behind. The items were sent to a lab and tested. The DNA matched samples from multiple victims going back to 1985. On July 7, 2010, police arrested Lonnie Franklin at his home. What they found inside was horrifying. More than 1,000 photographs of women, many nude, many unconscious, some bleeding or appearing to be dead. Hundreds of hours of videotape. Identification cards from women who'd gone missing. The .25 caliber automatic pistol used in 8 of the murders. And the Polaroid of Anitra Washington, hidden behind a wall, taken 22 years earlier right after Franklin shot her. Police released 180 of the photos to the public, asking for help identifying the women. Many were never identified. Investigators believe Franklin killed 25 people or more, but they could only prove 10. Franklin's trial didn't start until February 2016, nearly 6 years after his arrest. Prosecutors laid out the evidence. DNA connected Franklin to the victims. Ballistics matched the gun found in his house to 8 murders. The photos and videos showed his obsession with documenting what he did. Anitra Washington, now in her late 50s, took the stand and identified Franklin as the man who'd shot her in 1988. She pointed at him and said, "That's the person who shot me." The defense tried to argue the case was circumstantial and suggested maybe a relative did it, but they offered no proof. On May 5, 2016, after about a day and a half of deliberation, the jury found Franklin guilty on all 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On June 6th, the jury recommended death. On August 10th, 2016, Judge Kathleen Kennedy made it official. Franklin was sent to San Quentin to wait on death row. He never said a word in his own defense during the entire 6 years of court proceedings. He showed no emotion when the verdicts were read. No reaction when the death sentence came down. On March 28, 2020, guards found him unresponsive in his cell around 7:20 that evening. He was pronounced dead 23 minutes later. He was 67 years old. Number 3, Terrence Miller. In August of 2018, undercover detectives from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office in Washington were following a 77-year-old man named Terrence Miller. They'd been tailing him for weeks, watching him go about his daily routine, waiting for the right opportunity. That opportunity came at the Tulalip Casino, where detectives watched Miller finish a cup of coffee and toss it into a garbage can. The moment that cup left his hand, investigators moved in. They retrieved it, sent it to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, and within weeks they had their answer. The DNA on that coffee cup matched DNA found at a crime scene from 46 years earlier, a case so old that almost everyone involved in the original investigation was dead. On August 23, 1972, 20-year-old Jody Loomis left her home in Snohomish County on a white 10-speed bicycle. She was riding to a stable about 6 miles away to see her horse, a routine trip she'd made countless times before. Jody was studying to become a nurse and hoping to work at the same hospital as her fiancé. That afternoon around 5 o'clock, she was last seen riding up a hill on Penny Creek Road, a rural area surrounded by farms and trees. She never made it to the stable. Around 5:30 that evening, a couple drove up a dirt road off Penny Creek to do some target shooting. A tree was blocking their path, and when the man got out to move it, he found Jody lying on the ground. She'd been shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol and was partially undressed. She couldn't speak. The couple scooped her up and rushed her to Stevens Memorial Hospital in Edmonds, but she was pronounced dead on arrival at 5:45. A deputy coroner found signs she'd been raped. Her white bicycle had been tossed into a ravine 180 feet away, and the horse bridle she'd been carrying was gone. Detectives worked the case hard in the months that followed, chasing down every lead they could find. They collected biological evidence from Jody's body and preserved it for future analysis. But in 1972, DNA testing didn't exist. Without any solid physical evidence linking a specific person to the crime and no witnesses to the attack itself, the case went cold. Years turned into decades. Jody's parents passed away without ever knowing who killed their daughter. In 2008, 36 years after the murder, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit decided to re-examine the evidence. A technician at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab made a discovery that had somehow been missed by the county coroner's office, sheriff's detectives, and even the FBI. There was a tiny semen stain on Jody's left boot, the one she'd borrowed from her 12-year-old sister. The technician was able to extract a partial DNA profile from the stain, though it was somewhat degraded after all those years. They uploaded the profile to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, hoping for a match. There wasn't one. For the next 10 years, investigators used that profile to rule out potential suspects, but they never found their man. Then in July of 2018, Detective Jim Scharf made a decision that would crack the case wide open. He sent the DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs, a private forensics company in Virginia that specialized in genetic genealogy. This was the same technique that had been used just months earlier to catch the Golden State Killer in California, and it was starting to revolutionize cold case investigations across the country. Parabon extracted a genetic profile from the degraded sample and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public genealogy website where people who'd used services like Ancestry.com or 23andMe could search for relatives. The DNA matches came back pointing to distant relatives of the suspect. An Oregon genealogist named Deb Stone was assigned to the case, and she started building a family tree, working backwards from the DNA matches to find common ancestors, then forward again to identify living descendants. The research led her to an Edmonds family with 7 siblings, 6 brothers and 1 sister. One of those brothers was Terrence Miller, and when detectives looked into his background, they found something significant. In 1968, Miller had been convicted of lewd conduct after exposing himself to a 17-year-old girl in Mount Lake Terrace. That prior sex offense, combined with the fact that he'd lived in the Edmonds area in both 1972 and 2018, made him the prime suspect. Miller was 30 years old when Jody Loomis was murdered. He'd lived just 5 miles from where her body was found. By 2018, he was a retired heavy equipment operator who'd spent his entire career working across Western Washington. He'd been married to his fourth wife for 42 years, and together they ran a small ceramics business called Miller's Cove out of their garage, selling pottery on weekends. To anyone who knew him, he seemed like a normal guy who liked to bowl and golf, but Detective Scharf couldn't find any connection between Miller and Jody Loomis. This was a stranger attack, a random act of violence by what Scharf would later call a real predator. In late August of 2018, undercover officers from the Snohomish County Regional Narcotics Task Force began following Miller. They watched him for weeks, waiting for him to discard something they could legally retrieve and test. On August 28th or 29th, the exact date varies in reports, they followed him to the Tulalip Casino and watched as he threw a coffee cup into the trash. They grabbed it, sent it to the state crime lab, and in September, the results came back. The DNA from the saliva on that cup was an exact match to the DNA from the semen on Jody's boot. Detectives continued building their case through the fall and winter. In November, 2 undercover officers visited Miller's home in Edmonds, and his wife invited them into the garage to look at their ceramics. On a table, the detectives noticed a stack of old newspapers that the couple used for packing their pottery. Among them was a May 2018 edition of the Daily Herald, with a front-page article about how genetic genealogy had led to an arrest in another local double murder, a case that also involved rape and gunshot wounds to the head. Whether Miller had read that article and understood what was coming for him, no one knows for certain. On April 10, 2019, Terrence Miller was arrested at his home without incident as he returned from a brief outing with his wife. He was 77 years old. In June of 2019, Miller posted bail and was released to his home under electronic monitoring. He was ordered to surrender all his weapons and was supervised by a private company while he awaited trial. For the next year and a half, he lived in that house with his wife of 43 years, the same woman who'd been his high school sweetheart back when Jody Loomis was murdered. The trial began in late October of 2020 in Snohomish County Superior Court. It lasted 2 weeks. Prosecutors presented their case to a jury of 7 women and 5 men, and at the center of it all was the DNA evidence. The tiny semen stain that had gone unnoticed for 36 years, the genetic genealogy that had pointed them to Miller, and the coffee cup that had confirmed it beyond any doubt. The jury began deliberating Friday afternoon, November 6th, and continued Monday morning, November 9th. Shortly after resuming, they informed the court they'd reached a verdict. The judge and both legal teams were told to be in court at 1 o'clock that afternoon. But just before 10 that morning, a 911 call came in, reporting a suicide at Miller's home in Edmonds. A family member had found his body. He was 78 years old. When the jury was seated at 1 o'clock, Judge David Kurtz informed them that the defendant had died. The defense immediately moved to dismiss the case, arguing there was no point in taking a verdict now. But prosecutor Craig Matheson pushed back hard. After 48 years, he said, the Loomis family deserved to hear what the jury had decided. The judge sided with the prosecution. The jury foreman passed a slip of paper to the judge, and Judge Kurtz read it aloud. Guilty of first-degree murder. Number 4, Gary Raub. In 1976, Gary Raub was renting a room from Blanche Kimball in Augusta, Maine. Kimball was 70 years old, a retired dental technician who took in short-term boarders to help make ends meet. Raub had been staying at her State Street home for a week or two when neighbors started noticing something was wrong. They hadn't seen Kimball in days. On June 12th, police went to check on her. Inside the wood frame house, they found blood splattered across the kitchen and glass shards on the floor. Blanche Kimball was lying on a daybed in the living room. She'd been stabbed 44 times. The medical examiner could tell she'd fought back hard. During that struggle, her attacker had been injured. Investigators found blood at the scene that didn't belong to Kimball, small drops on a kitchen drawer, and scattered around the room. Raub was questioned twice. He denied having anything to do with Kimball's death. But in 1976, police didn't have the technology to test that foreign blood, so they couldn't prove he was lying. The case went cold. 6 months later, Raub was caught breaking into a house nearby. Police arrested him with a knife in his hands. He went to prison for 5 years, and after his release, he left Maine. He eventually ended up living on the streets of Seattle. In 2003, Maine State Police Detective Abby Chabot took over the Kimball case. She started going through the evidence that had been sitting in storage for nearly 3 decades. Then, in October 2011, something happened in Seattle that changed everything. Raub got into a fight with another homeless man and stabbed him. The victim disappeared before charges could be filed, but Seattle police kept the knife. When Detective Chabot found out about the incident, she had the knife tested. A forensic analyst compared the blood on that knife to the blood from Kimball's kitchen drawer back in '76. It matched. The odds of it being someone else were 1 in 399 million. But that partial profile from the knife wasn't enough on its own. Detectives needed a fresh DNA sample directly from Raub. That's where Seattle Police Detective Mike Sosinski came in. On the afternoon of July 18, 2012, he walked into the University District with a plan. He'd bought 3 packs of gum and 3 packs of cigarettes, and he'd made up a survey listing different brands. Dressed in street clothes, he found Raub sitting on the sidewalk along University Way, a stretch known for homeless encampments. Sosinski walked up and asked if Raub wanted to make $5 participating in a chewing gum survey. Raub said sure. He chewed the gum samples, handed them back, and pocketed the money. He had no idea what he'd just done. Those pieces of chewed gum went straight to the Maine State Police Crime Lab. The DNA in Raub's saliva matched the blood on Kimball's kitchen drawer and the knife from the Seattle stabbing. 2 months later, on October 15th, detectives from Maine flew to Seattle. They found Raub in his usual spot in the University District and arrested him. He was 63 years old. Raub initially said he was innocent, but in June 2014, he changed his mind. He entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder, which meant he wasn't admitting guilt, but agreed the state could probably prove it. In a jail interview, he said he didn't remember Kimball or what happened, but he pled guilty because it must have happened. The judge gave him 20 years. 2 years into his sentence, on June 29, 2016, Gary Raub died in a hospital in Maine. He was 67 years old. Number 5. Robert Plimpton. In the spring of 2021, detectives from the Gresham Police Department in Oregon were watching a 57-year-old man named Robert Plimpton. He was living in Troutdale with his wife and son, working as a river guide, going about his life like any normal person. But investigators knew something Plimpton didn't. They knew he was likely responsible for one of the most brutal murders in Gresham's history, a case that had gone cold for over 40 years. They just needed proof. The detectives followed him for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Then one day, they watched as Plimpton spit a wad of chewing gum onto the ground. The moment that gum left his mouth, detectives moved in. They collected it, sent it to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab, and within days, they had their answer. The DNA on that chewing gum matched DNA found on the body of 19-year-old Barbara Mae Tucker, who had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and beaten to death near her college campus on January 15, 1980. Barbara Tucker was a student at Mount Hood Community College in Gresham, studying business. She was nearly 6 feet tall, strong, athletic. On the night of January 15th, she was expected at class but never arrived. Witnesses that night saw something horrifying. A woman with a bloody face, waving her arms, running onto Kane Drive from the woods near the college parking lot. People saw her trying to flag down cars, desperately trying to get help. They saw a man dragging her back into the bushes, but nobody stopped. Nobody realized they were watching a murder happen in real time. The next morning, students arriving for class at Mount Hood found Barbara's partially clothed body on a shrub-covered slope in a wooded area between Kane Road and the parking lot. The medical examiner determined she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death, her head and face destroyed by blunt force trauma. It was a savage, brutal killing that shocked the small farming community of Gresham and sent investigators scrambling for answers. But there were no answers. Police had witness descriptions, they had evidence from the crime scene, but they had no suspects. The case went cold almost immediately, and for the next 2 decades, Barbara Tucker's murder remained unsolved. Her family, including her 2 older sisters, Susan Pater and Alice Wan, held on to hope that someday they'd get justice. But as the years passed, that hope faded. Susan later said she thought the killer was probably dead, that they'd never know who took her sister's life. In 2000, investigators made a crucial decision. They sent vaginal swabs that had been taken during Barbara's autopsy to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. By then, DNA technology had advanced enough to create a profile. The lab developed a male DNA profile from those swabs, the killer's DNA. But when they ran it through every database they had, there were no matches. The DNA sat in a file for another 20 years, with no way to identify whose it was. Then in 2021, the Gresham Police Department reached out to a Virginia-based company called Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon specialized in something called genetic genealogy, using DNA to build family trees and identify suspects, even when there were no direct matches in criminal databases. The company assigned their chief genetic genealogist, a woman named C.C. Moore, to the case. Moore and her team at Parabon ran the DNA through something called snapshot DNA phenotyping, a system that could predict what someone looked like based on their genetic code. The results were striking. The system predicted with extremely high confidence that the killer had red hair. In fact, Parabon scientists said it was the most confident red hair prediction they had ever made. That detail became the key to everything. C.C. Moore started building family trees, tracking down people who shared DNA with the unknown killer. She found World War II draft record cards of red-headed men. She followed that red hair trait down through generations, watching it pass from father to son, narrowing the pool of suspects. The trail led her to Oregon. And in March of 2021, 41 years after Barbara Tucker's murder, Moore identified a likely suspect. His name was Robert Plimpton. Detectives dug into Plimpton's background, and what they found was disturbing. He was 16 years old when Barbara Tucker was killed, a teenager in high school. But 5 years later, in February of 1985, Plimpton had been convicted of second-degree kidnapping. A woman walking home from the grocery store had accepted a ride in his truck. Plimpton slammed her into the footwell and tried to bind her arms with duct tape before she managed to escape. He served 2.5 years in prison for that attack. Between 1993 and 1997, he racked up 2 more 6-month sentences for DUI convictions and parole violations. In 1997, he was accused of attempted sodomy and assault in an attack on another woman, but a grand jury found insufficient evidence, and the case was dismissed. After the 1990s, Plimpton seemed to stay out of trouble. He married his high school sweetheart, the same woman he'd been dating back in 1980 when Barbara Tucker was killed. They had a son. He settled in Troutdale and worked as a river guide. To anyone who knew him, he was just another middle-aged man, living a quiet life. But Gresham detectives now knew better. They found Plimpton in Troutdale and began watching him, waiting for an opportunity to get his DNA without tipping him off. The opportunity came when they saw him spit that piece of chewing gum onto the ground. The moment the gum was discarded, it became legal for police to collect it. They grabbed it, sent it to the lab, and got their confirmation. The DNA matched. On June 8, 2021, as Robert Plimpton was driving away from his home in Troutdale, police pulled him over and arrested him. He was 57 years old. He was charged with rape and murder in the death of Barbara Tucker and held at the Multnomah County Detention Center. When detectives knocked on Susan Pater's door to tell her they'd solved her sister's murder, she was stunned. She'd assumed the killer was long dead. The detective who had worked the case, Aaron Turnage, had promised her years earlier that he wouldn't quit until it was solved, and he'd kept that promise. Plimpton pleaded not guilty. His defense attorneys, Stephen and Jacob Hughes, decided to waive a jury trial and go with a bench trial, meaning a judge would decide his fate. The trial took place in front of Multnomah County Circuit Court Judge Amy Baggio and lasted 3 weeks, from February 26th to March 15th, 2024. The defense argued there was reasonable doubt. They pointed out that witnesses in 1980 had described the man with Barbara as being about her height or taller, and Barbara was nearly 6 feet tall. Plimpton was closer to 5'8". They also claimed investigators never tested Barbara's clothing for DNA evidence. But the prosecution had the DNA from the chewing gum, and it was a perfect match to the DNA found on Barbara's body. On March 15th, 2024, Judge Baggio delivered her verdict. She found Robert Plimpton guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder under different legal theories. The rape and sexual abuse charges were dropped because prosecutors couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the assault happened while Barbara was still alive. But Judge Baggio made her position crystal clear. She said, "To be clear, this court has zero doubt whatsoever that Robert Plimpton beat Barbara Tucker in her head and face until she died. He did." The judge sentenced Robert Plimpton to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years before he'd be eligible for parole. That was double the mandatory minimum of 20 years required under the 1979 sentencing guidelines that applied to his case. Plimpton would be around 101 years old before he could even be considered for release. On October 3, 2024, Robert Plimpton was immediately transferred to the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections, where he'll remain for the rest of his life. Number 6. John Athen. On the morning of November 12, 1982, police in Seattle's Magnolia neighborhood found the body of 13-year-old Kristen Sumstead inside a cardboard box behind a TV repair shop. She'd been strangled with a bathrobe belt and sexually assaulted. The alley where she was found was a common hangout for local teenagers, and investigators quickly began questioning kids from the area. One name came up immediately. 14-year-old John Athen lived nearby and had been seen the night before, pushing a large box on a grocery cart near where Kristen's body would be discovered. When detectives questioned him, Athen said he'd been using the cart to steal firewood from neighbors. Kristen's friends told police that Athen had been infatuated with her, constantly trying to get her attention, but investigators had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Blood tests and polygraph exams were conducted on dozens of suspects, but nothing stuck. The case went cold. John Athen left Seattle in the early 90s and settled in New Jersey, where he started a construction business and got married. For the next 20 years, he lived what appeared to be a normal life. In 2002, the Seattle Police Department formed a cold case squad. Detectives Dick Gagnon and Greg Mixell pulled the Sumstead file and sent preserved semen samples from Kristen's body to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. DNA technology had advanced dramatically since 1982, and this time the lab successfully extracted a male DNA profile. They ran it through state and federal databases, but there was no match. Whoever killed Kristen had never been arrested for a serious crime. The detectives went back through the original case file, and John Athen's name kept appearing in witness statements and investigative notes. They tracked him down to Palisades Park, New Jersey, but now they faced a problem. The cold case squad was working with limited resources, handling about 300 unsolved murders. They needed Athen's DNA to confirm whether he was the killer, but flying across the country to try to obtain it through legal channels would be expensive and time-consuming. The detectives brainstormed a cheaper solution. In March 2003, Gagnon and Mixell, working with Detective Linda Diaz, created a fictitious law firm. They designed official-looking letterhead listing their names as attorneys and crafted a letter inviting John Athen to join a class-action lawsuit for overpaid parking tickets. The letter promised potential money back and included an authorization form that needed to be signed and returned by a deadline. The entire ruse cost 37 cents in postage. The detectives were banking on Athen doing what most people did in 2003 when mailing a letter back, licking the envelope flap to seal it. Athen took the bait. He signed and dated the authorization form and even added a handwritten note that said if he was billed for any legal services, they should disregard his signature and participation. Then he sealed the envelope and mailed it back to Seattle. When the envelope arrived, Detective Diaz received it but didn't open it. She forwarded it directly to the crime lab to preserve the evidence. A lab technician opened the letter, photographed the contents, then carefully cut off a portion of the envelope flap where Athen's saliva would be. Forensic scientist Beverly Himmick extracted DNA from the dried saliva and compared it to the DNA profile from the semen found on Kristen Sumstead's body 21 years earlier. It was a perfect match. Based on the DNA evidence, prosecutors obtained an arrest warrant. In May 2003, two detectives flew to New Jersey. They read Athen his Miranda rights and questioned him about the murder before telling him they already had a warrant. Athen denied everything. He said he barely knew Kristen Sumstead and had never had sexual contact with her. He denied using a grocery cart to move a box the night she died. At trial in January 2004, his defense attorney argued that the DNA evidence had been obtained illegally. He claimed police violated Athen's constitutional rights by posing as lawyers and tricking him into giving up his DNA without a warrant. But King County Superior Court Judge Sharon Armstrong ruled the evidence admissible. In February 2004, a jury convicted John Athen of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. John Athen served just over 7 years in prison. In 2011, the Washington State Indeterminate Sentence Review Board determined he'd been rehabilitated, expressed remorse, and was unlikely to reoffend. King County prosecutors and Kristen Sumstead's family strongly opposed his release. But in August 2011, Ethan walked out of prison and moved back to the Seattle area to live with his brother. Number 7. Joseph James DeAngelo. Joseph DeAngelo was a police officer. From 1973 to 76, he worked for the Exeter Police Department in California's Central Valley. In 1976, he transferred to the Auburn Police Department in the Sierra foothills. And while he was wearing a badge, patrolling neighborhoods, and responding to calls, he was also breaking into homes at night, raping women, and eventually murdering couples in their beds. For more than a decade, he terrorized California under different names. They called him the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. But he was all the same person, and nobody knew it. The crime started in 1974 with a series of burglaries in Visalia. DeAngelo would break into homes, ransack drawers, scatter women's underwear around, and steal small items like coins and jewelry. On September 11, 1975, he shot and killed a professor named Claude Snelling during an attempted kidnapping. He kicked Snelling's daughter 3 times in the face and ran. By 1976, the attacks had escalated. DeAngelo moved to the Sacramento area and began raping women in their homes, often while their children slept nearby. He'd shine a flashlight in their faces, tie them up with shoelaces, and spend hours in their houses eating food and drinking beer. He threatened to kill entire families if anyone moved. When he started attacking couples, he'd force the women to tie up their husbands or boyfriends, then place dishes on the men's backs, and tell them he'd kill everyone if he heard the plates fall. By 1978, he'd committed more than 50 rapes across Northern California. Then he started killing. In February 1978, he shot Brian and Katie Maggiore while they were walking their dog in Rancho Cordova. In 1979, he moved to Southern California and began breaking into homes in Goleta, Ventura, Dana Point, and Irvine. He'd rape the women, then bludgeon or shoot both victims to death. Between 1979 and 1986, he murdered at least 10 more people. His last known crime was in May 1986, when he raped and killed 18-year-old Janelle Cruz in Irvine. After that, the killings stopped. DeAngelo went quiet and disappeared into ordinary life. He'd been fired from the Auburn Police Department back in October '79 for shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent. After that, he worked as a truck mechanic at a grocery warehouse in Roseville for 27 years until he retired. He was married, had 3 daughters, and lived in a quiet neighborhood in Citrus Heights. For 40 years, investigators had DNA from the crime scenes but couldn't match it to anyone. In 2001, DNA testing confirmed that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. Crime writer Michelle McNamara gave him a new name in 2013. She called him the Golden State Killer. In 2016, the FBI offered a $50,000 reward and announced a renewed push to solve the case, but there were still no matches in any criminal database. DeAngelo had never been arrested for anything serious enough to require DNA submission. Then, in December 2017, investigators tried something new. Detective Paul Holes and an FBI lawyer named Steve Kramer uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy website called GEDmatch. The search returned 10 to 20 distant relatives who shared DNA with the killer at the level of great-great-great-grandparents. A genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter took that list and started building family trees. She worked backward through generations, constructing branches and narrowing down possibilities. After months of work, the team identified 2 potential suspects. One was ruled out when a relative's DNA didn't match. The other was Joseph James DeAngelo. He fit the age range, had lived in the Sacramento area during the crimes, and matched the physical description, including blue eyes that investigators had noted in composite sketches. In April 2018, detectives placed DeAngelo under surveillance. They followed him for 10 days, waiting for the right moment. On April 18th, an officer swabbed the door handle of DeAngelo's car while he was away. A few days later, they collected a tissue he'd thrown in his curbside garbage can. Both samples were sent to a lab and tested. The DNA matched samples from multiple crime scenes going back to 1985. On April 24, 2018, police arrested 72-year-old Joseph DeAngelo at his home in Citrus Heights. After he was taken into custody, he sat alone in an interrogation room and muttered to himself, Prosecutors later said he told himself, "I did all those things. I destroyed all their lives." D'Angelo was charged with 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. He couldn't be charged with the rapes because California's statute of limitations had expired, but prosecutors made sure the full scope of his crimes was part of the record. On June 29, 2020, D'Angelo stood in court and pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnappings. He also admitted to 161 other uncharged crimes, including the 50-plus rapes. In total, he confessed to harming 87 victims across 11 California counties. The plea deal took the death penalty off the table in exchange for his admission of guilt. Judge Michael Bowman sentenced him to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 15 concurrent life sentences and an additional 8 years. D'Angelo was sent to California State Prison in Corcoran, where he remains in protective custody. He's now 79 years old. Number 8. Jerry Westrom. On June 13, 1993, property managers at the Horn Towers apartment building in South Minneapolis got a call from a tenant on the 20th floor. Water was leaking into her apartment from somewhere above. When the managers went upstairs to investigate, they traced the leak to an apartment on the 21st floor. The door was unlocked. Inside, the shower was running, and water was flooding out of the bathroom into the hallway. Then they saw the blood. It was everywhere. On the walls, on the bedroom floor, spattered across the bathroom. 35-year-old Jeannie Childs was lying naked on the bedroom floor, wearing only socks. She'd been stabbed 65 times. Some of the wounds had been inflicted after she was already dead. Her stomach had been cut open with her innards exposed. She had defensive wounds on her hands, which told investigators she'd fought back. Bare, bloody footprints led through the apartment, left by whoever killed her. Detectives collected evidence from the scene. They found semen on a comforter and a bloody towel in the bathroom. There was a washcloth on the toilet seat with DNA on it, blood in the sink, and DNA on a red t-shirt. The footprints were photographed and documented. The problem was that in 1993, DNA testing was still relatively new. There was no national database to search, no way to run the samples and get an instant match. Investigators looked at Jeannie's boyfriend, Arthur Gray, who lived with her in the apartment. He was allegedly her pimp and managed her work as a sex worker, but Gray had an alibi. He was out of town when Jeannie was killed. With no other leads, the case went cold. For more than 20 years, the evidence sat in storage. Jeannie's mother, Betty Eekman, kept in contact with the Minneapolis Police Department, refusing to let her daughter be forgotten. In 2015, detectives decided to reopen the case. DNA science had advanced significantly since the 90s. What couldn't be done before was now possible. Investigators sent the DNA samples to a lab to create a detailed genetic profile. In 2018, they uploaded that profile to GEDmatch. The search didn't produce any useful results. So they tried a different approach. They uploaded the profile to another genealogy site called MyHeritage, this time using a pseudonym. The upload was done without the company's knowledge, which violated the site's terms of service, but it worked. The system returned a list of DNA matches, people who shared genetic markers with the unknown killer at the level of distant cousins. A genealogist took those matches and started building family trees, working backward through generations to narrow down the suspect pool. After months of research, the team identified 2 potential suspects. But their focus shifted to a 52-year-old businessman named Jerry Westrom. Investigators ran a background check and learned that Westrom had lived in the Twin Cities area from April 1991 to December 1993, the exact period when Jeannie Childs was murdered. They also found that he'd been convicted of soliciting a prostitute in 2016. But a genealogy match wasn't enough to make an arrest. They needed direct DNA evidence that could hold up in court. In January 2019, investigators began surveillance. They followed Westrom to a hockey game in Wisconsin where his daughter was playing. FBI Special Agent Chris Bokers and his team watched from a distance as Westrom went to the concession stand and bought a hot dog. He sat down at a table, ate, and when he finished, he wiped the left side of his mouth with a napkin. Then he walked over to a trash can in the lobby, placed the napkin inside a cardboard food container, and threw both away. He headed back into the arena for the second period of the game. As soon as he was gone, investigators retrieved the napkin from the garbage. The law was clear on this. Once something is discarded in the trash, There's no expectation of privacy. It's fair game. The napkin was sent to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for DNA testing. The results came back with a mixture of DNA, but the major male profile was consistent with the DNA found at Jeannie Childs' crime scene 26 years earlier. On February 11, 2019, around 6:30 in the evening, Minneapolis police arrested Jerry Westrom at his office in Waite Park. During questioning, he denied everything. He said he'd never been to the Horn Towers apartment building. He said he didn't recognize Jeannie Childs. When investigators told him his DNA had been found at the scene, he said he had no idea how it got there. Detectives collected a direct DNA sample from Westrom and sent it to the lab. This time, the results were even more definitive. His DNA matched the semen found on the comforter and the towel. It matched a mixture found on the washcloth. It matched DNA on the red shirt and the blood in the sink. The lab reported that 99.993% of the general population could be excluded as contributors to that DNA mixture. On February 14, 2019, Westrom was charged with second-degree intentional murder. He posted $500,000 bond and was released. But in June 2020, a Hennepin County grand jury reviewed the evidence and returned a more serious charge. Westrom was indicted for first-degree premeditated murder. A warrant was issued, and he turned himself in. The trial began in August 2022 in Hennepin County District Court. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the footprint analysis, and the video of Westrom's interview with police where he denied ever being at the apartment. On August 25, 2022, the jury received the case. After 2 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict. Guilty on both counts, first-degree premeditated murder and second-degree intentional murder. On September 9, 2022, Westrom was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The sentence was based on Minnesota's 1993 guidelines, which were in effect at the time of the murder. Current law would have required life without parole, but the judge applied the statute from the year the crime occurred. Westrom appealed the conviction, challenging the use of the genealogy database and arguing that his constitutional rights had been violated. In May 2024, the Minnesota Supreme Court issued its ruling. The court upheld the first-degree murder conviction, but vacated the second-degree charge, stating that a person cannot be convicted of both for the same crime. Jerry Westrom is currently incarcerated at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in St. Cloud. He'll be eligible for parole in 2052 when he's 86 years old. Number 9. Gary Hartman. On the morning of March 26, 1986, 12-year-old Michella Welch and her 2 younger sisters left their home in North Tacoma, Washington, and walked to Puget Park. It was spring break, and they were going to spend the day playing at the park. Around 11 o'clock, Michella rode her bike home to make lunch for her sisters. She came back to the park, chained her bike next to her sister's bike, set the sandwiches on a picnic table, and went looking for her sisters, who had left to use the restroom at a nearby business. Sometime around 1:30 that afternoon, an employee from Michella's school saw her talking to a man who was pointing down a trail into a gulch. When her sisters returned to the park around 2 o'clock, they found the lunch and the bike, but no Michella. They contacted their babysitter, who called police. Officers began searching the park just after 3 in the afternoon. At 11:30 that night, a search dog found Michella's body in an isolated area of the gulch, more than a quarter mile from the playground. She was lying near a makeshift fire pit. She'd been assaulted, beaten with blunt force trauma to the head, and her throat had been cut. DNA evidence was collected from the scene, including semen found on her body. Detectives interviewed witnesses and followed leads. A 13-year-old boy who'd been at the park said he saw a man under a bridge that day who kept looking at the girls. He described him as white, in his mid-20s, skinny, wearing a blue jean jacket with holes in it, but the man was never found. 5 months later, another Tacoma girl, 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian, disappeared while riding her bike at Point Defiance Park just a few miles away. Her body was found 3 weeks later. She'd also been sexually assaulted and murdered. Police initially believed the same person killed both girls, but the cases went cold. In 2006, investigators developed a male DNA profile from the evidence collected at Michella's autopsy. They ran it through state and national databases. There were no matches. The profile sat in the system for years, with nowhere to go. In 2009, Detective Lindsay Wade reopened both cases. She compiled a list of more than 2,000 names, everyone who'd been interviewed, considered, or mentioned during the original investigations. In 2013, she had Jennifer Bastian's swimsuit tested. A DNA sample came back, and it was different from the DNA found on Michela's body. That confirmed what investigators had started to suspect. 2 different killers, 2 separate cases. In 2015, Tacoma police contacted a company in Virginia called Parabon Nanolabs. The company specialized in something called DNA phenotyping, which uses genetic markers to predict what a person might look like based on their DNA. In May 2016, Parabon delivered a report. Based on the DNA from Michela's killer, they predicted he was a white male with fair skin, brown eyes, and brown hair. He was likely of Northern European descent with a small amount of Native American ancestry. The company created a computer-generated composite image. It was just a prediction, but it gave investigators something to work with. They released the image to the public and activated a child abduction response team to treat the case as if it had just happened. 60 people participated. A tip line was opened. Detectives collected DNA samples from 160 men who'd been on the suspect list. None of them matched. Then in February 2017, Detective Wade reached out to an investigative genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter. This was a new approach. Instead of just comparing DNA to criminal databases, genetic genealogy uses consumer DNA websites to find relatives of an unknown person. Wade sent the killer's DNA to a lab that created a detailed genetic profile. Ray Venter uploaded that profile to a public genealogy website called GEDmatch. In May 2018, after months of building family trees and cross-referencing public records, Ray Venter and a genealogist at Parabon both came back with the same result. They'd identified 2 of the killer's second cousins. One of them lived in Washington. Using census records, newspaper archives, and social media, they traced the family tree back several generations and then forward again, narrowing down the possibilities. The trail led to 2 brothers who'd both lived in North Tacoma in 1986, Gary Hartman and his younger brother. On June 4, 2018, Tacoma police began surveillance on Gary Hartman. He was 66 years old and worked as a registered nurse at Western State Hospital in Lakewood, where he helped discharged psychiatric patients transition back into the community. He lived on the shores of Steilacoom Lake with his 3rd wife. He had a collection of vintage cars and was often seen driving them around the area. He had no criminal record. On June 5th, Detective Steve Riopel followed Hartman from the hospital to a nearby restaurant where he was meeting a coworker for breakfast. Riopel sat at a table about 10 feet away and watched as Hartman used a brown paper napkin to wipe his mouth several times. When Hartman finished, he crumpled the napkin, placed it in a paper bag, crumpled the bag, and set it aside while he kept drinking his coffee. After Hartman and his coworker left, an employee started cleaning the lobby. Riopel approached the employee and retrieved the bag with the napkin inside. The napkin was sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. On June 19th, the lab confirmed that the DNA on the napkin matched the DNA found at the crime scene in 1986. The next day, June 20th, officers pulled Hartman over during a traffic stop in Lakewood and arrested him. He was 66 years old, 32 years after Michela Welch was killed. During questioning, he denied ever being at Puget Park. He denied knowing Michela. He said he had no idea why his DNA would be at the scene. Police searched his home and his workplace. He was charged with first-degree murder and first-degree rape. Bail was set at $5 million. Hartman pleaded not guilty. Before trial, his attorneys moved to suppress the DNA evidence. They argued that using the GEDmatch database to compare the crime scene DNA with his relatives' profiles violated his privacy rights under the Washington State Constitution. In March 2022, Hartman waived his right to a jury trial and chose a bench trial, meaning a judge would decide his guilt. The trial lasted less than 2 hours. Hartman broke down in court. He was 70 years old and needed a walker to cross the courtroom. Sobbing, he placed his head in his hands and said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. God knows I'm so sorry. That doesn't help. I'm just sorry." The judge sentenced Hartman to 26 years and 6 months in prison, the maximum sentence allowed. In 2023, the Washington Court of Appeals upheld the conviction. Hartman is currently serving his sentence at Airway Heights Correction Center in Washington. Number 10. Raymond Rowe. On the afternoon of May 31st, 2018, Raymond Rowe was working as a disc jockey at Smoketown Elementary School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was doing what he'd done hundreds of times before, playing music at a school function, entertaining kids and teachers under his professional name, DJ Freeze. What Rowe didn't know was that undercover officers from the Pennsylvania State Police were in the room watching him. They weren't interested in his music. They were waiting for him to finish his water bottle or throw away his gum. When he did, they moved in, retrieved the items from the trash, and rushed them to the state crime lab. 26 years after a brutal murder, investigators finally had their suspect's DNA. On the morning of December 21st, 1992, Christy Mirak got ready for work in her townhouse in East Lampeter Township, just outside Lancaster. She was 25 years old and taught 6th grade at Roarstown Elementary School. Her roommate left for work around 7 that morning. Christy was still home, dressed in her coat and gloves, preparing to leave. Sometime between 7:10 and 7:20, neighbors walking near the townhouse heard a high-pitched scream coming from inside. When Christy didn't show up to school that morning, a staff member went to her home and found her body on the living room floor. She'd been beaten with a wooden cutting board, her jaw was fractured, and she'd been strangled to death. The autopsy confirmed she'd also been sexually assaulted. Police collected DNA from her body and from the carpet underneath her, but when they ran it through the national database, there were no matches. Investigators interviewed over 1,600 people over the next several years. They followed up on every lead, took blood and hair samples from multiple suspects, and eliminated them one by one. In 2007, Christy's brother Vince put up a billboard in the community asking for information. Nothing came of it. The case went cold. By 2015, when the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office took it over, they were out of suspects. The DNA was still there, but it didn't match anyone in the system. In 2016, prosecutors sent the DNA to Parabon Nanolabs, which created composite sketches based on the killer's genetic traits: hair color, eye color, skin tone. The sketches were released to the public in November 2017 and generated tips, but none led anywhere. Then, in April 2018, the Golden State Killer case broke open using a new technique called genetic genealogy. Lancaster County prosecutors decided to try the same approach. In May 2018, Parabon converted the crime scene DNA into a data file and uploaded it to GEDmatch. The file matched several distant cousins of the killer. Cece Moore, Parabon's head genealogist, started building a family tree. She worked backward to the great-grandparents of those second cousins, then built forward in time, looking for someone in the right place with the right ancestry. She narrowed it down to a family in Lancaster with Northern European descent and some Puerto Rican heritage. On May 14, 2018, she identified Raymond Rowe. Rowe had lived about 4 miles from Christy Mirak in 1992. Prosecutors learned that her apartment was on a likely route between his home and his workplace. Witnesses had reported seeing a white car parked facing the wrong direction near Christy's townhouse between 6 and 7 on the morning of the murder. Rowe had owned a white Toyota at the time. Investigators also found a ticket to the Chameleon Club in Christy's wallet. Rowe had been the house DJ there every Friday. Whether they'd ever met, no one knew. But Rowe had never been on the police radar. He had no criminal record. For 26 years, he'd lived openly in the same community, became a local celebrity DJ, got married for the 4th time, had children, went to church, and ran a successful entertainment business. Once detectives had his name, they needed his DNA to confirm the match. That's when they set up surveillance at Smoketown Elementary School. After Rowe finished his set and discarded the water bottle and chewing gum, officers collected them and sent them to the lab. The results came back definitive. The probability that the DNA belonged to anyone other than Raymond Rowe was 1 in 200 octillion for the Caucasian population. An octillion is a 1 followed by 27 zeros. There are only about 7.6 billion people on Earth as at that time. On June 25, 2018, police arrested Raymond Rowe at his home on Whittier Lane in Lancaster without incident. He was charged with criminal homicide and held without bail. At first, he pleaded not guilty, and prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. His trial was scheduled for May 2019. But in January of that year, Rowe changed his plea. On January 8, 2019, he stood in Lancaster County Court and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, rape, and related counts. Through his attorney, he admitted he'd killed Christy Mirak. Under the plea agreement, Rowe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus a consecutive sentence of 60 to 120 years. 2 years later, Rowe filed a petition to withdraw his guilty plea. He claimed he and Christy had engaged in consensual sex and that she was alive when he left, suggesting someone else must have come in and murdered her afterward. He requested DNA testing on 5 additional items from the crime scene. The judge called his explanation incredulous and denied the request. The Pennsylvania Superior Court upheld that decision in 2023, noting that the DNA technology Rowe wanted to use had already existed when he pleaded guilty and his defense team had known about it. Raymond Rowe remains in prison at the State Correctional Institution in Waymart, Pennsylvania. For decades, these killers believed they'd escaped justice. They built careers, raised families, and lived ordinary lives while their victims' families waited for answers. But they all made one fatal assumption: that time had erased their crimes. They didn't count on DNA technology catching up with them. These cases prove that cold doesn't mean closed, and justice may be delayed, but it's never denied. If you enjoyed this series and want more deep dives into cases like these, hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.